Yay.
Wow.
Hi, everyone.
How you all doing? I want to, first of all, thank Lance. Can we give Lance and Tracy and Helena a round of applause? Lance is right. I'm thankful to Helena for inviting me here and to make me aware of this festival. And I did not think that I could get my friend Eve Ensler to be a part of this, because she's busy. She's all over the world. Oftentimes I'll text her and I say, well, where are you in the world today? You know, is it Africa? Is it Europe? Is it here in America? And you don't even know what coast, but she is one of my she-reels. I have to say that publicly. I would not... There's not a place that I go and speak as a male ally to women and girls as we talk about issues of gender violence where I don't mention Eve Ensler, Bell Hooks, Gloria Steinem, Audre Lorde, women that have had a big impact in my life. And I'm so clear, I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation if it wasn't for your work. So I just want to thank you publicly for that.
Kevin.
Thank you. She's dope. 9 months ago, she started a part of this thing, Stop Trump. A couple weeks ago, she wrote a piece for Huffington Post, which I really encourage all of you to read if you haven't seen it, about the rape culture of Donald Trump. And in the last 7 days,
Whoa.
Can you talk about the piece?
Yeah.
Please, because this is crazy where we are right now.
Well, first of all, I thank you all for being here today. It's so great to see so many people. And thank you to Uncharted for inviting me. But I just wanted to say a few words about Kevin. I love Kevin Powell. And I love him for a lot of reasons. One, he has such a vision of where race and gender come together. He has stood up for years fighting for all kinds of people, grassroots people, women, black and brown people, and he's been an amazing writer. And if you haven't read his new book, The Education of Kevin Powell, it's a beautiful, devastating account of what it was like to grow up in the ghetto, to live in poverty, to fight and struggle as a black man in America. And it ripped my heart apart, but it also made me aware of what a miracle Kevin Powell is sitting amongst us. Wow. And I'm proud to be on this stage with him.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I just want to say, I don't know about all of you, but I was just talking to Susan Swan, who's the executive director of V-Day and OBR, and she said to me that Donald Trump's initials are DT. DTs, like we all have the delirium tremors, and I kind of feel that way. I feel like we're in culture shock.
Yeah.
I don't know about all of you, but there is such radical traumatization of the culture right now. I don't know how you can be alive as a woman, as a black or brown person, as a Muslim, as a Mexican, as a Jew, it turns out. I mean, every day the spread of contamination infects another community. And to see this unprecedented level of hatred coming in all these directions, it's very traumatizing. In terms of the article that Kevin was talking about, I have had my eye on Donald Trump for many, many years. And I'm just going to tell this story. I don't know how many years ago when Donald Trump began to gentrify New York, and there were massive of homeless people. Of course, it was under Reagan, who systematically destroyed this country. I hold him really responsible for the beginning of the end. There were thousands and thousands of homeless on the streets, and we did a demonstration against Trump, which we called Come to Brunch at the Plaza. And we bought busloads of homeless people, and we set up brunch at the plaza, outside the plaza. And waiters came dressed in these really sophisticated outfits, and we served brunch to thousands of homeless people. And people were actually sending food out from their rooms, to join us. But my contempt for Donald Trump is lifelong. So this is not new. But I know when we started the Stop Hate Trump campaign about 9 months ago, everybody told me I was crazy. This couldn't possibly happen. And I said, no, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. Yeah. We live in a country where phenomena happen. And those phenomena spin and spin and spin and stir up often what is dormant and lying under the surface. Right. And I feel what Donald Trump has done is spun up the story of America that has not been processed or dealt with, whether it's racism or a rape culture that is rampant, whether it's Islamophobia, we name it. it is what we haven't, it's our karma come to roost. And in a way, it's an amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, it is up now, it is here, and now it is time for us to build in every direction the kind of progressive movements we need to go at it. And, you know. But I just want to say in terms of rape culture, I mean, it's so amazing to see what has happened in the last week. In two directions. In the horror of it, in the kind of, you know, I heard somebody saying last night, I believe it was Donald Trump, that all these women are lying. Now, the preposterous notion that a white privileged man could stand up and say, one after one after one after women coming forward are lying, even to say that is so preposterous, you know? And it's such an indication of really how far gone he is. But I will say, what's more disturbing is all the people around him. The GOP, which has licensed him and not stopped him, the Stephen Bannon, who is an accused wife batterer himself, Roger Ailes, who is a sexual predator, there's 24 cases of sexual harassment against him, who was essentially running a high-profile sex ring at Fox News. I mean, we can go down the list. And I think in the long run, that is what is most telling. And a media that, in my opinion, early on, made him spectacle. And allowed him to go as far as he has gone. So I think all these are complicit forces. But one of the things I want to ask Kevin is, I'm sure you all saw the story today about the building where Somalian people are living, where three white men, terrorists, were planning to do a four-cornered bombing of that building. And I think one of the very scary things that has happened is that white nationalism has been mainstreamed and legitimized. And whether it's the KKK or, I mean, we go down the list, they are now mainstreamed. They are now out from under the rocks. They have been given license, and they are, and we know Donald Trump doesn't only not distance himself from these people, but is inviting them in full view. So I would like you just to talk about the connection, like what is the connection of a racist rape culture?
Woo! There's a lot to say here and unpack. You know, when you mentioned Reagan, one of the things I thought about is that when Bobby Kennedy was running for president in 1968, I need to take it back for a second, he had the support of working class blacks, Latinos, white sisters, and brothers. When Reagan ascended to the presidency in 1980, he was able to pick off these folks that were disaffected. They were called the Reagan Democrats. And that, to me, is the roots of white nationalism, of course, going back to '64, Barry Goldwater. And when I look at what's going on in this country, I'm not so much just concerned with Donald Trump and people like him, but I was just in Alabama, and it's not about the South, because as Malcolm X said, the South is really south of the Canadian border, if we're really honest about it. Particularly if you're a person of color in this country, because you don't even know where you can go. This is why Black Lives Matter arose. But there's a feeling that has been spread over and over again, as you said, that people of color, women, queer sisters and brothers, anyone who is different or other is somehow the problem that's blocking them from their progress. And these folks are actually, as we know, voting against their own economic interests, and it's manifesting in this kind of vile hatred. It's the young white brother, Dylan Roof, who shot up the black church in South Carolina, and ironically, the pastor of that church is from the same hometown in South Carolina my family is from. It's the things that I see when I'm traveling around the country speaking and people telling me, you know, we're tired of this thing with civil rights, we're tired of this Black Lives Matter thing, you know, the hatred for Colin Kaepernick, telling him to go back to Africa, and I'm saying to him, hey, do you realize his father's black, his mother's white, he's raised by two white parents, and so where's he exactly going other than Wisconsin, you know? But the ignorance that's fostered in all of this, and I mean, to me, it's all interconnected. When I was in Birmingham yesterday, I talked about, I mean, these folks are grossly miseducated, but all of us are grossly miseducated. Very few of us even see the intersectionality of all these different issues. And I would even say, Eve, with all due respect to folks, some of us who call ourselves progressive and liberals, we'll get into our silos, and we'll say, this is our issue, and then we'll see how other issues are relevant to us. I'll say it, even as a black man, you know, I think it's unfair, and I'm for the rest of my life, I'm going to be anti-racism, anti-white national, anti-white supremacy, whatever term you want to call it. But because of my education around gender and gender violence, there's no way I can ignore when women, including black women, are the victims of some form of oppression as well. There's no way I can ignore if someone who happens to be queer is oppressed. And it took a re-education, and that's what's really missing. And when I think about a progressive, multicultural, multi-generational movement in this country, are you willing to do the work to examine where we all come from, how we were educated or miseducated, and begin to challenge each other in these spaces? Because I think I understand why people applauded Hillary Clinton around the term deplorables, and I definitely understand why folks say that some of these folks are not redeemable. But I've had conversations, interesting enough, as a black boy from the ghetto, I've ended up in some interesting places in America. And I've had conversations with people in Perrysburg, Ohio, in this part of Washington State, in this part of Wisconsin, and, they have simply never been introduced to any other ideas. And when you talk about the Reagan era, not only did we get the Reagan Revolution, but it manifests itself in Fox News Channel, the Christian Coalition. When I was in college at Rutgers University during that time, the Young Republicans, and so they literally inculcated every part of American society. And Trump is simply the latest, most incredible phenomenon, as you put it, of all of this. And the question becomes, as you said, what are we actually going to do around this now? What is organizing going to look like? And I know we're going to talk about that later, about building social movements, but that's what I'm really interested in. Where are we going to go from this? Because, yeah, the election is important, but we can't just get riled up every 4 years. We have got to create a consistent movement here, because Reagan got elected in 1980. It's now 26. This is 2016. This is 36 years later. You see all the manifestations of what Reagan led to. So.
Yeah, and I think in connection to that, I've been reading a lot about Roger Ailes.
Yeah.
And looking at kind of the history of Fox News. And I think it's very interesting that in a parallel way, as the country was being indoctrinated by the values of the Tea Party and the Christian right, inside that corporation, women were being abused, right and left. And I think there's something metaphoric about that for the whole situation of this country. But I think part of what happens is everything in this country ends up getting so isolated, right? We isolate our various issues. So we have climate change people working over here, and anti-racist people working over here, and gay liberation and trans liberation working over here, and we have women's liberation working over here. And we can go, and rather than understanding that we are fighting the same forces, we are fighting neoliberal, capitalist, patriarchal, racist forces. And this is the same story. It's one story. The right figured that out a long time ago. The right figured out how to focus on all of us, in one go. And what we have to do is in a way, I really believe this in the progressive movements, not only become more generous in the sense that we understand we have our issue and we have our passion, but we also have each other's issues.
That's right.
We have to expand our own capacity to be in solidarity with each other.
I agree.
And that's something we've been talking about a lot, particularly in 1 Billion Rising this year, because the call is solidarity against the exploitation of women. And what that means in all its various forms, whether it's solid exploitation of women through racism, or exploitation of workers through workplace violence and lack of pay equity and fair wage, or whether it's exploitation of women through sex trafficking, we have to expand each of our silos. So we're all living in the same story and in the same tent. And I just want to say, I think one of the problems is that we operate in this country sometimes not as a movement, but as NGOs that are funded. And what that funding does, and often funding from above, is it determines our relationship to each other.
That's right.
And we all have to begin to say, we're in this fight whether we're funded or not.
That's it.
We're in this fight because we're fighting for freedom and liberation and equality and an end to the kind of despicable hatred we've seen.
I totally agree with that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, October, this month marks the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Black Panther Party for self-defense here in the Bay Area. And, when Eve was speaking, I thought about Huey Newton. People don't realize that the Panther Party, we kind of think Panther Party, they're only for black people. No, actually, Huey Newton, you could look it up. He wrote about solidarity with the women's rights movement. He wrote about solidarity with the gay liberation movement, as it was called back in the early 1970s. And so he, even as a visionary black leader, understood we have to be connected to different spaces. And that doesn't mean that you reduce your space. There's certainly issues that, for me as a black person, as a black man, that I'm always going to talk about. I'm never going to be apologetic about fighting racism. This is real to me at every level. We're talking about the prison-industrial complex, which Angela Davis has talked about so eloquently for years, and Michelle Alexander. We're talking about, the educational system. I'm going to Fremont High School in Oakland on Monday. Shout out to them on the east side of Oakland. But, and always hearing, everywhere I go, how our children are suffering in the public school system. And a lot of it is not just how they're treated, which is a big part of the problem, which I consider educational malpractice, but the curriculum in 2016, which is still teaching them racist ideology like Columbus discovered America, and you don't see themselves in the curriculum. And so we have to challenge these things, but it can't just be black and Latino people or people of color challenging it. We have to have white sisters and brothers as allies saying, you know what, this is our miseducation as well, which is why I'm proud to be in Berkeley, where Indigenous Peoples Day, not Columbus Day. You know what I mean? And that's the kind of solidarity I want to see on a consistent basis. And Eve, you've been a great example of that. You know, even supporting women of color through the years, the Say Her Name movement, for example. You know, can we talk about how we even got to this work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Why don't you start?
I was born in a log cabin. No.
Talk about your book and talk about, like, you know, the
Yes,
genesis.
ma'am.
You know.
Well, you know, one thing, and I so appreciate her because when I sent her a manuscript, I felt like it was 600 pages. It was mad long, and she read it. She read it. And one of the things that touched me, Eve, and I don't even know if I said this to you, the fact that you said this is as much your mother's story as it is your story. And again, there's no way I would have considered writing it from the perspective not just myself, but my mother and my aunts, if it wasn't for your work, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, a whole range of people. I'm a product of poverty. I'm one of the people that Dr. King was talking about at the end of his life when he said we need a poor people's campaign in this country. I'm one of the people that Marvin Gaye was singing about on his album What's Going On, when he said save the children. You know, I'm a product of the hip hop era. I'm a hip hop head. You know, and hip hop really is the culture was created by poor African Americans, poor Latinos, and poor West Indians in a place called New York City. And there was a parallel energy happening with African Americans and Latinos here on the West Coast. We have to acknowledge it was also happening on the West Coast. That's important. You know, my mother has an 8th grade education, you know, but from the time I was 3 or 4 years old, she said to me, you're going to college, you're going to college, you're going to college, because she was a product of that period called the Civil Rights Movement. She was born in 1943 on August 28th. She literally turned 20 on the day Dr. King gave that speech in Washington, D.C. And my mother, they had no TV, no radio. I mean, the poverty was vicious that she grew up in South Carolina. But she said, you know, there was something about that movement that affected her. And one of the things that she realized was that education could give me the life that she never had, you know. And so she was forced to raise me by herself, and this is a whole other conversation about masculinity. My father wasn't there, you know, what we call toxic manhood, you know, basically seeing yourself just as a player, as a hustler, as a pimp, as someone, you know, a lot of us as men have been socialized to see women strictly as mother figures, caretakers, or as sexual objects. Well, my father was one of those people. And so my mother had to raise me on welfare, food stamps, government cheese, the kind of poverty I wouldn't wish on anybody. But she was the first leader and the first teacher and really the first activist and the first feminist, when I think about it, that I ever met in my life. She doesn't know those words per se, but I know now, all the work that I've done, all the studying, this is what my mother was. She was always out school fighting for me. She was always pushing for me to get a quality education. She was always fighting crooked land persons, these folks who, the capitalism you're talking about, abusing people of color or poor people, no matter what your race, in inner city environments. Y'all know what I'm talking about in the Bay Area, right? You know, and she instilled in me that you have to fight for justice. But it wasn't until I got to college that I became an activist. It was the anti-apartheid movement. Nelson Mandela was still in jail. I started learning about South Africa, and I realized I didn't know anything about Black American history because the wonderful integrated school system that I went to in America, again, oftentimes it stopped after World War II. I didn't learn anything about the Civil Rights Movement, women's rights movement, gay liberation movement, nothing. No movements. It was like war and war and more war, you know. But I was transformed at Rutgers University. We used to call Rutgers Berkeley East, y'all. The 2 to 4 years I was in school, even though I didn't graduate, we took over buildings. We were very serious about fighting for justice. But the thing that I talk about in the book, which is very honest, here I am becoming very race conscious, but I was still very much a sexist male. In fact, I feel that it got accelerated in college because you're now in an environment where as a first-year student, you're being told by older men on the campus that, you know, there's so much sex happening on this campus that we don't need electricity to keep the lights on. You want to talk about rape culture. You want to talk about sexual assault and this permission that men were giving each other on these college campuses. That's what was happening where I was there, and that's what I see now in the work that I do visiting college campuses. And so I'm not proud of the fact that, I'm proud of the fact that we did a lot of work around racism, but I'm not proud of the fact that it wasn't until my own destructive behavior, which I describe in the book, after college, you know, led to me realizing, you know what, how can you talk about justice that's just convenient for you, you know? And so I was challenged. And what began as a work around gender issues and gender violence eventually led to me, also understanding that I need to think about my queer sisters and brothers, and how, what we call, again, that intersectionality. But this was a process over years, you all. It wasn't something that happened overnight. And I had to do a lot of work, and it was a lot of soul searching. There was a lot of counseling and therapy, and I still believe in that fully. But I think that you can't be an agent for change if you're not willing to do the difficult work of going inside yourself. And so, that's why I said at the beginning, I appreciate the work of women like Eve Ensler, because the honest to God truth is, in my 4 years of college, the only book I read by a woman was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Never took a gender studies class, never took a women's studies class. And when women leaders and women student leaders would talk about issues around sexism, we would just ignore them. We would just ignore them. And so that's my genesis with activism, and it's hard work.
But what compelled you as a man to open that door?
Honestly, I want to go back to my mother. One of the things my mother always said to me was, don't be like your father. And I didn't know what that meant per se as a child. I knew that, my mother is 73 now. She still says, well, she thinks that all men on the planet are no good, like none. And if I mention my father, and my mother goes to church every Sunday, she's always quoting the Bible, but she curses better than anybody in the world if I mention him, because she's hurt. And you talk about trauma. She was traumatized by the experience of giving herself to this man and being abused, emotionally. Not physically, but it was emotional abuse. But my mother, and it forced me, when I was challenged by women, women from who were feminists, young feminists, they said to me, we need you to be an ally. You need to read this work. And I remember the first thing I read was a little book by Pearl Cleage called Mad at Miles. It scared the heck out of me as a man, because it shook my foundation, because Pearl was writing a response to the vicious violence, gender violence of Miles Davis versus his wife, Cicely Tyson. And I'm thinking to myself, Miles Davis, this man who made all this beautiful music. But, I started to learn, well, Miles Davis was a batterer. John Lennon of the Beatles battered his first wife. We can go down a list of men. Here we are celebrating them in one space, but they were never checked in other spaces. And basically would say, Kev, do you want to be this kind of person for the rest of your life? Do you want to be this kind of person? And the answer was no. And I was told that you need to do a few things. You need to own who you are. You need to challenge yourself. You need to get help, which is the counseling and therapy. You need to read and study and relearn what both manhood and womanhood mean. And I was told, if you're really serious about this work, then you need to do the work with the men and the boys, just not be around the women and the girls. And that was the same thing that we as black students had said to white students in college. Do the work in the white community. Now, don't just be around the students of color. And now I was being challenged around my privilege. And that was profound for me, in my early 20s, no less, to really think about this. So it was hard. It's hard, but it can be done, But I don't want any special applause or anything like that. I feel like this is the work that we as men and boys should be doing organically, naturally. Women and girls are our equals, are our equals, are our equals. And Eve, the first time I heard the statement, 1 out of 4 and 1 out of 3, I actually started asking women in my life, and I was struck by the number of women and girls that I knew who were survivors of some form of sexual violence. I mean, everywhere, every race, every culture. And that really hit home for me. When Mary Baraka's daughter, who was a queer woman, and her partner got killed by the husband of their oldest daughter about 10 years ago, it was the saddest funeral I've ever been to in my life. And so what I realized happened for me is that I became aware. A lot of us as men, or whatever your privilege is, a lot of times we're not aware of who is being victimized by our privilege, Just like a lot of times we as black people say that white folks just don't understand how racism, you don't have to be a vicious racist like Donald Trump, but if you don't say anything, you're a vicious racist like Donald Trump. You're acquiescing by your silence, and the same thing goes for us as men. And that was a profound shift for me to understand that and to, be awake about it. Yeah.
I think in terms of violence against women, I think one of the things that's been so incredible about this last few days is to see the outpouring of women breaking silence and speaking out. Yeah. And I think, I was thinking this morning, having, been part of a movement that's been working to end violence against women and girls for the last 20 years, the last week, to be honest with you, feels like, in a way, a normal week in my life. Wow. And in all of our lives. It's almost like, and I'm sure this is true for all those who are working in an anti-racist world and seeing the kind of police shootings and daily violations that are coming into one's inbox. It's astonishing to me that it has taken this long in this country to rise up both the insane racism and the insane misogyny and rape culture that is here. And I think I'm kind of amazed in a way. I mean, as horrible as it is, it's kind of like some grotesque birth, you know, of like both this toxic spill like rising to the surface where we have to look at it. And at the same time, to sit and listen to the discourse that's going on everywhere. It's kind of amazing to have fought for so long for people to take sexual violence and rape culture seriously. And I think, you know, and I think what you're talking about is like, what are the ways that we support rape culture and racism that aren't directly participating in? I was reading this story today about a man getting sick on an airplane, and a young African-American woman doctor stood up to take care of him. And the flight attendant said, "Oh, sweetie, sit down. Where would you be a doctor? How could you possibly be a doctor? Who are you?" And completely annihilated her and minimized her and degraded her. And then later, after it didn't go so well, they came back to her and said, "Do you think you can help?" And I thought, that is the daily thing that black and brown people face in this country, right? In the same way that how many women on an ongoing daily basis are grabbed, attacked, assaulted, encroached on, minimized, undermined. And I think, I don't know about all of you, but this period is kind of allowing my rage up. Like, I have a lot of rage. I have a lot of rage. And somebody said to me the other day, "You're angry." And I said, yes, there is a lot to be angry about, right?
We should be angry.
I mean, to hear the kind of discourse that is being spoken about women, to hear the numbers of women, that one man, okay, Donald Trump, in his wake, how many women have been hurt, shut down, made to feel less than, demeaned by this one man? Okay, I'm sure there are many, many, many more who are not coming forward. So we think about, this is what we live through every single day in this country. And I think, okay, we're at the tipping point. This is the tipping point of a lot of things. It is up to us as progressives. The window is open, and if we don't push our bodies through to make sure it never closes again, it's on us.
That's right.
This is our moment, and we have got to rise and make that happen.
I agree.
So I'm gonna, okay, I'm gonna read a question. There's so many good questions. Okay, if we are to believe a woman's story by default, what are we to think about the 4 women Trump brought forward that were victims of Bill Clinton?
Well, I think Bill Clinton is a sexist as well.
Yeah.
You know, let's just call it what it is. I mean, I can't, whether we want Hillary Clinton to win or not, we can't ignore the fact that, and it's interesting because Bill Clinton's presidency paralleled my 20s in the 1990s. And so I was growing into this consciousness that I was talking about around gender issues. I mean, in the beginning, I was just like, when the first case came up in '92, when he was running, I remember thinking, wow, Bill is kind of wild. You know what I'm saying? He's married, and this is coming up, you know. And it was said that someone is making this up. Was this Jennifer Flowers was the first one? Was that?
Yeah.
But fast forward to '97, '98, Monica Lewinsky, and I'll never forget when Bill Clinton got on TV and said he did not have sexual relations with that woman, and he lied to the American people. And so just because you support Hillary Clinton doesn't mean you should ignore the fact that her husband has been sexually abusive his entire life. We shouldn't do that. You know, I respectfully disagree with that. And I think that, you know, something you said in the video, Eve, that if we paid attention to this the way we pay attention to the Super Bowl, it was a powerful quote. I believe that we have got to permeate every aspect of American society with conversations around gender identity and gender violence. That's what I believe now. You know, last year when the book first came out, I was invited by a group of women educators, because oftentimes it's the women doing the work for the men. Unfortunately, this is real, and we need more men to be involved in this. But these were 5th, 6th, 7th grade boys, and guess what they wanted me to come talk about? Gender violence. Because the boys, as I described in the book, when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, were already running around grabbing girls' body parts. And it was profound, and some of the folks were like, is it too early to talk with these boys? No, it's not too early, because these boys will be abusers, they'll be batterers, they'll be rapists when they get older if we don't talk about it when they're kids, because they're getting these hardened ideas the way I did and other boys did, that this is okay just to touch a girl any way you feel like. And I just think that, this conversation needs to happen in sports, it needs to happen in entertainment, in these spaces that have such a profound influence on so many of us as young males. I think about the Bill Cosby situation. Am I going to sit here as a black man and act like, black men don't engage in the behavior just like white men and Latino men and Asian men and Native American men and Jewish men and Christian men and Muslim men? It's all men, y'all. It's all of us. It's all of us. It's all of us. And just because you are in a position of power and privilege does not give us the right to just be abusive. It's just, we have to challenge it, And I just think that is the work. And I just, I see some men out there. We've got to be a part of this. Women can't do this by themselves,
Well, speaking to that, I've never understood why violence against women was a woman's issue.
Yeah.
We're not raping ourselves, y'all. That's not happening, okay? And I think one of the things that happened early on is that women sensed men weren't going to take this on. So, again, we generously took this issue on.
Right.
But it's not our issue,
right.
Okay? And I want to say that I think, how do we end rape culture? There are so many ways to go at it.
Yeah.
But one of them is I think we live in a country which is ironically overly sexualized and seriously prudish. And it's a very bizarre complication, right?
Yeah.
Rather than saying our children, when I was doing research for The Good Body, I was interviewing a lot of kids in, grade school and high school who were giving oral sex in homeroom. But meanwhile, parents were talking about the fact that they couldn't be talked to about sexuality. Okay, that is very confusing, okay?
Yeah.
And part of what I think we have to really break through in this country is we need to teach our children about healthy, intimate, loving sexuality. And I'm not talking about those videos, where you see this is what an organ is and this. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how do we teach young people, the younger the better, as far as I'm concerned.
I agree.
Because, I'm hearing about 6-year-olds now who are looking at pornography on their iPhones. People like 6-year-olds, okay? We need to talk about what is touch, what is consent, what is loving consciousness and connection. We need to stop being prudish because our prudishness is allowing a culture, a rape culture, to evolve out of control. And I can't think of anything more important than that.
You know, I was in Kentucky a couple weeks ago, and a father said that his son and a young girl, his son is under 10, and they were engaging in the exact conversation you're talking about. Meanwhile, and this is not to step on anyone's toes, but how many of y'all really were educated about sex or intimacy when you're growing up?
No one.
No one.
We learn about geometry. We learn about, why do we assume people know what good sex is? Why do we assume that? First of all, nobody does. When I was doing the vagina monologues and I would interview women, I cannot tell you how many women had bad sex, right? Sex, and sex because...
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Not me, but
part of it is because boys don't know what good sex is.
We don't know.
Right?
No.
So from the time they're young, right, they think, okay, sex is like I jump on a girl. And they don't know what they're doing. And then a girl gets jumped on and goes, okay, that was like the worst experience ever. And then the cycle of sexual misery begins. If we said to our boys...
Can we quote you on that? The cycle of sexual misery.
But it's true.
It is very true.
If we said to our boys, slow, that's a good idea. Invitation.
Yeah.
Taking your time, moving in. If we were teaching boys that...
Luther Vandross.
Exactly. Marvin Gaye, If we were teaching boys
Not a hip-hop song, y'all.
Yeah.
Or a rock song.
Yeah. But I'm saying... I'm not kidding when I'm saying this.
Serious,
this is as serious as...
Yeah.
Because culture begins from the time you are born. Culture is shot into you from your parents, from the environment. You can bring up your kids in an incredibly liberated house, and the day one in school, that will all change. So all of us are creating this culture. All of us are making it.
One of the things I talk about in my memoir, and I was, writing an autobiography, as you know, writing something autobiographical, you just have to tell the truth. I talk about a young girl who no one ever knew the name of, but the boys labeled her Hori Dory. You know, because the assumption was no one even knew the fact that she had sex with all the boys in the neighborhood. And I remember just following her around, never did anything, but just followed her around because this is how I was socialized. This policing that we do, in our communities. You need to get you some, you need to get you some, and this is how you do it. I mean, I remember grown men would say to us, hey, boys, and we're 6, 7 years old, the way to get some hair on your face is to do X, Y, and Z to a girl. I mean, this is insane instructions, you know what I mean? And this is sex education, and then, as you talked about, growing up in the New York metro area in the 1980s, that meant the 25-cent peep shows, now you're being socialized by pornography and strip clubs. You don't know anything. I remember thinking, not until I was probably close to 30, I even remotely knew what it was to actually know how to make love, because everything else was just jumping on, not knowing what intimacy is. And I remember women saying I remember in college, women said, that's it? And I'm like, well, yeah, I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. Because I was not just ignorant, I was enthusiastically ignorant. A lot of us are,
But related to that, I don't think it serves men either.
No, it doesn't.
I think when you fail to please a woman, if you are a heterosexual man, that is a very significant failure. And I remember when I was in, we have a wonderful sister in Kenya, in Iraq, who we support, who's one of the leaders of ending the FGM movement in Kenya. And I was there, and there were a group of boys, and she does these amazing classes where she teaches boys why female genital mutilation is damaging. And so she was teaching these boys this class, and she was saying that when girls have their vaginas cut and their labia removed and they're sewn up with thorns and it ruins them for life. They can't have sexual pleasure after that. So the boy said, well, why would that be good for us? Why would we want to be with a woman or a wife who we couldn't please? And Agnes said, exactly my point, right? and I think, to me, that's so metaphoric. I think when I say the cycle of sexual misery, what I'm saying is we grow up not teaching our men how to be connected to women. So they feel progressively like failures. And that failure turns inward, and they're mad at themselves. They become mad at women, and that builds towards a kind of violence. If we taught our men how to be in sync with women and to be loving towards women and to satisfy women in the deepest way, I promise you, violence would be significantly reduced.
It was so profound. I spent a year at a very famous school in California. I won't say the name of it. And I was brought there to work with the fraternities, 11 fraternities, because of the rape culture on the campus. It's out of control. And so I had imagined spending one night after another with each of these fraternities. And I asked this very simple question. What is a man? They gave me a list, and when they finished the list, I said, you just described my mother. Now can we ask the question again? Because they would say things like leadership, responsibility, accountable, you take care of the house. I'm like, well, that's my mother, And what was clear to me is that most of us have never thought about what it is to be a man. We're given some things like, you got to be tough and you got to be aggressive. And when I was growing up, you had to fight. I mean, our rites of passage was fighting at school, fighting it, meet us at lunch, meet me at lunch, meet me after school. You had to play sports. I suppressed that I wanted to be a writer from the time I was 11, 12 years old because that wasn't considered manly. You know what I mean? I love Shakespeare. I kept that to no one needs to know I love Shakespeare. You know what I mean? And it just, it's these young men at this college, the minority of them actually knew how to relate to women, and they were frowned upon by their peers because they said that we should be respectful, and it just is. We've got to deal with this, fellas. Like, this policing again, and what are we policing toward? And I would argue it's not just here in our intimate relationships, but when you live in a world where war is the solution for everything, this hyper-masculinity on every level, dropping bombs on people. I think about Dr. King talking about Vietnam and how he was ridiculed for not being manly because he was about peace. And I believe that being a man should be about peace and love. What is wrong with that? What is wrong with that? And if I could just say this one thing, one question came up the other day when I was in Alabama, Eve. A young man asked a profound question. He said, well, how do you navigate if you're a heterosexual male, as you are? I said, I still love sports, but I question a lot of things in sports now. I'm still a hip-hop head, but I question things in hip-hop.
That's one of the questions.
Ah.
What are your thoughts on hip-hop culture's influence on things like rape culture and women's issues?
I say that we should make a distinction between hip-hop culture and the industry. What I support is the culture. I represent the culture. The culture, again, was created by working class people, poor people. It's the DJ, the MC, graffiti writing, the dance element, and the fifth element is knowledge. You know what I'm saying? I support the culture. I was a b-boy, I was a graffiti writer, I was a founding staff member of Vibe magazine. I curated, produced the first exhibit on hip-hop at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in the late 90s. I am a hip-hop head for life. This thing saved my life, like a lot of us would say, you know. My writing is a reflection of hip-hop. The way I walk, everything I do is hip-hop. You know, just like you've had folks who are rock heads or jazz heads. The industry is a whole other thing. This culture was created to be about life, and to me, the industry became about death. And I really believe that when we started, the culture started to become the dominant youth culture around the planet in the late 80s, early 1990s, there were folks in power, back to the capitalists that you talked about earlier, who said, let's take the most backwards parts of this thing and push that. NIGGAs, BITCHs, reckless disregard for women, hatred of women, violence against women, love affair with drugs and alcohol and party and anti-intellectualism and hypermaterialism. And that has become the thing that has come to dominate. And when you don't have any education around manhood or masculinity anywhere, and this is the dominant culture of the time, and really, you know, I always say to people, it's not just hip hop, you know, let's talk about jazz music and some of the jazz musicians. It's like we act like the women jazz musicians didn't exist in the 1920s. We keep pulling up Louis Armstrong and other folks. We act like, you know, well, guess what? People like David Bowie and other folks actually engaged in rape culture as well, and they're considered rock icons. This is a problem with popular culture across time that has been male-centered, and hip-hop is just the latest male-centered art form. And I think that we have to have those conversations. I mean, one of the things that I've been talking about, we've been dealing with this year, you talk about rape culture and sexual assault. Africa Bambaataa, one of the founders of hip-hop, has been charged with sexually assaulting a number of young males. And people don't want to have the conversation. You know what I mean? And this is a conversation we need to have. Like, why is this okay? You know, but he's being protected the same way we've protected other men in our society. You know, well, he's the father, godfather of hip-hop. No, if you are a sexual predator, you're a sexual predator. And if there's a number of people saying it, be it women or men, that they've been sexually assaulted, we need to pay attention to this. And, you know, there's a man named Ronald Savage who came out and said this happened to him, and he's been attacked by a lot of people. But I think that we have to have people inside of hip-hop, whether it's the culture or the industry, who are willing to who are courageous enough to say, this is not acceptable behavior. You know, I was proud of Macklemore when he made the song Same Love about homophobia, but we also need to have these conversations about sexism. I mean, there's a lot of songs that have celebrated, honestly, rape culture. We've talked about pulling trains on women. And, you know, I listen to songs very differently now than when I was coming up in hip-hop. Like, man, this song is about raping women. This song is about beating women. I can't support that. But also, how does this industry continue to put this stuff out there, knowing that it's affecting all these young men and older men around the country? Because God knows we have men in their 40s and 50s who are like, man, that's my song. I'm like, do you realize what you're saying? You know what I mean? So,
which is related to this question. With regard to sexual harm, how can we drop the gender-based lens as boys, men are also victims of sexual harm? Since hurt people and heal people, ending sexual violence requires a broader lens.
Yeah.
I just want to say about that, you know, I think one of the biggest hidden stories that's going to come up is how many boys in this country are sexually abused.
Yeah.
I think it's the final frontier that we don't want to look at.
Yeah.
And I think, and if they're not literally sexually abused, I think when we bring up boys and we tell them not to have feelings, when we tell them not to be vulnerable, when we tell them not to live in their heart, when we tell them not to cry, when we tell them to shut down, that is a form of violence. We are actually turning somebody into somebody else. And going back to militarism, you know, if you look at the programming that the Army does to get people to be able to kill, it's not that much different than the programming of patriarchy, right? It's an exaggerated form of it. But in fact, if we are really serious about ending rape culture, I look at so many young boys, and I've had this experience a lot, particularly when I traveled in the old days with the vagina monologues, where guys would finally, after maybe a half-hour discussions, would come out and say, look, I don't know how to be vulnerable. I don't know how to open my heart. There's no male spaces where I don't get trampled for that.
Yeah.
There's no context in which I get to be a vulnerable, heart-filled, open, loving man. And it's up to all of us to create that context for men, you know, and not push, you know, and I fault myself because when I look at Donald Trump and Stephen Bannon and Roger Ailes and you know, I begin to go, oh my God, I can't deal with men. I start to go into that space, and I'm sure a lot of women here know what I'm talking about. But I also am really working now to say, what injury happened to that person that they have cut off their heart and have become so mean and so cruel, and how do we get to the root of that? Because one of the things we don't want to do in this country is ever get to the root of anything.
That's right. That's
you know,
right.
We punish people, we incarcerate them, we launch attacks on Iraq, rather than looking at the fact it was 11 people who were outraged by the occupation of their lands and the desecration of the First World, you know, War in Iraq. We never want to go back to what is at the core of things. What's the history of things?
That's
What's
right.
the history of racism in this country? What's the history of genocide towards indigenous people? What's the history of rape towards black women in this country under slavery? What are the histories that are informing what is happening right now? And if we don't get to those roots, we're going to be doing this forever, you know?
When you said, I wrote a blog for Utne Reader earlier this year called Will Racism Ever End? Will I Ever Stop Being a Nigger? And it was written out of exasperation because something you said earlier, Eve, it's like there's no way you could watch all these videos as a black person of people being shot and murdered, chokehold to death, you know, what happened to Sandra Bland, and it's not just black men, as we know, it's black women as well who've been killed, you know, Oscar Grant here in the Bay Area. There's a long list. And, you know, it's exhausting. It is exhausting to explain to people over and over again, this is what it feels like to be a person of African descent in this country. And don't tell people that they're making it up, that they're exaggerating, you know, that this is something in the past and it doesn't belong to today, because what she just said was so profound. If we don't get to the history of this thing, let's be really honest about it. The first global economy in the world was called the transatlantic slave trade.
That's right.
My ancestors were brought forcibly to this country, and we built this country. That's the bottom line, you know? And this is not to make people feel guilty, to feel uncomfortable, but it's just like we have to tell the truth, that this country was rooted in racism. What happened to indigenous people is called racism, you know? And the fact is, if we, for the sake of argument, 1619, 1865, my ancestors were enslaved. And we've actually were enslaved longer than we've been, quote unquote, free in this country. And if you add on 100 years of segregation to that, y'all know what that looks like. And then you look at from the 60s, the civil rights movement, to the Reagan era, where I, as a young activist, had to go down south with other young students, and we actually were re-registering people to vote, because the Reagan era was actually the beginning of voter ID laws and disenfranchising people. And we start talking about where crack cocaine came from. We're talking about the destabilization of the Black Panther Party, Dr. King, all these attacks that happened, you know, the prison industrial complex. I mean, all the things that have happened to our communities over and over again. You know, I'm not speaking about myself, but Eve is actually right. When you see people like me sitting here where I come from, this actually is a minor miracle, because we're not supposed to be sitting in these spaces. You know what I mean? And that's what racism does on a regular basis. And sexism, and homophobia, and transphobia, and a disrespect for disabled people, and all the forms of hatred and oppression, is that it traumatizes you over and over and over again from every single angle. And for me as a black person, you know, I know when I'm sitting here, I'm not just speaking for myself, I'm speaking for every black person who will never have this opportunity. When I write something, it's for every black person who will never have this opportunity. I love all people. I love all people. I really do believe that we're all sisters and brothers. But I also have a profound love for my own people, and I know what we've been through. When I'm in Alabama, like I was this week, and I'm meeting people who are 70, 80, 90 years old, who are just simply happy that they got the right to vote, Eve. They weren't asking for much. Can we just vote? Can we move from point A to point B without getting killed because of who we are? You know what I'm saying? And so, you know, one of the things I think about is like, you know, are we willing to do the work? Because it can't just be black folks or people of color, but we need allies that are really going to stand up and have those uncomfortable conversations again and again and again. You know, because it's unfair to expect black people to be the metaphorical mammy historically and present day for white America.
And I just want to say in regards to that, part of what I feel solidarity is about is knowing when it's your turn and when it's not your turn.
Yes, ma'am.
And sometimes it's about shutting up and serving.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about shutting up and listening.
That's
You
right.
know, I think one of the problems white people have, if I may speak as a white person, is
no.
Yeah. is that we are so prone to guilt and to make it about us.
Yeah.
Right? And so we don't have the span to listen. We always want to jump in and say, no, be quiet. Give space to hear the story.
Yeah.
Give space to hear the pain. Give
Yeah.
space to hear the ambition and the desire and the dreams that are being trampled upon. And don't make it about you.
Right.
Don't make it about you, because making it about you shuts down the conversation.
That's right.
And I think that's really what generosity is about.
Wow.
You know? And I feel the same thing about men.
Yes.
You know, I hear this about men all the time, like, oh, you just hate all men. No, I don't hate all men. But I do think men need to shut up and listen. They need to shut up and listen.
I agree.
They need to hear what it means to walk through the world as a woman and be hit on and grabbed at and attacked and negated and degraded every single day of our lives. And you just need to listen to it and not make it about you. Part of what we get into in this culture so often is the I. If we are going to build movements, it's got to be we. And that means we take turns. We take turns. There's a time when we listen to one story and we feel for that story and we work on that story. And there's a time to work on other stories. But part of what we've learned from this neoliberal, isolating, atomized culture is I got to get mine. I got to fight for my space. I got to fight for my issue. I got to fight for my people. I've got to fight for my story. And no, we have to fight for each other's stories. And we have to find the way to do that, particularly now in the face of this rising, mad, white supremacy, crazy, anti-everything that's happening under the Trump whatever we're calling it, you know.
I agree. You know, I want to, there's more questions.
There's so many questions.
I want to acknowledge Colin Kaepernick. This young man's 27 years old. He's a football player. He could have said, you know what, I've got this multi-million-dollar contract, and if I just stay quiet, I could make sure I have a starting quarterback job, if not with the 49ers, somewhere else. One thing he said, because I watched every interview that he gave. He said that I took the time to study, which a lot of us don't do, and I feel like that's got to be a part of the process. And that was my training. We were talking about how we became activists, Eve. It's like, you know, we had to study. You have to read. You have to study. You have to travel. You got to be willing to explore. And you can hear it in his articulation of it, you know. And I just think that what I'm thinking about is like, man, here's someone who's now taking a stand around racism. Imagine, because football culture is loaded with issues of rape culture and sexual violence. Imagine if we could have the same conversation with these players, not just about racism, but I'm from New York. I'm a New York Giants fan. Our kicker, Josh Brown, the kicker, his wife said that he beat her at least 20 times. The National Football League suspended him for one game, and he's back playing like nothing ever happened. And so, you know, I think, and it was a woman sports writer, and we need men sports writers to say this, not just the women sports writer. It was a woman sports writer, I can't think of her name, and I apologize, who said, we're passionate about this over here, which is right, what Colin's tackling about, but we're ignoring all the stuff over here. And I think that you're right. We've got to be willing to listen to each other and see, hey, all forms of oppression are unacceptable, y'all. You know, because if you're not free, then I'm not free. And one of the things I don't want to be in my lifetime is I'm fighting for freedom, then I'm turning around and be an oppressor of someone else. You know, when you said that, you know, I've had to sit there and listen, men, to women. I've had to sit there as a heterosexual male and listen to my queer sisters and brothers. You know, what is it like for what you're dealing with? You know what I mean? I need to understand, because you don't develop empathy and compassion if we're not willing to listen.
I also think it's about educating ourselves, like you're saying. Like, you know, I think because of the internet, everything is just like fast opinions, push a button. But you know, what we're seeing in the corporate media is often not the story. And people have to do much deeper exploration of what's really going on. And also surround yourself with people who challenge you.
That's right.
You know, Kimberly Crenshaw is one of my best friends. And she challenges my ass every day, right? And I appreciate that because I feel the two of us are constantly going back and forth in a dialogue, which we're going to have at Bioneers, by the way, next week, about intersectionality. And there's a lot of stuff I miss, I don't get.
Yeah.
And she'll call me on it. And I want to be called on it.
Yeah.
That's how we grow. That's how we expand. So we have to put ourselves in environments with friends, with communities who will call us on things, not in a way where you're dead and you're fired. I hate you, you're over, but you're not thinking about this.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
haven't opened that door over there. Your consciousness isn't raised over here. All of us are in a process of decolonizing ourselves, of de-sexisting ourselves, whatever that word is. We're all in a process of declassing, you know, looking at how we view class, and none of us have arrived. And part of it is, if we're on a continuum, then what are the ingredients, what are the mechanisms we're giving ourselves to continue an evolution of thought and consciousness? In regards to that, I'm going to give you a question.
And I have a question for you after this. All right.
You inspired me last year at the annual legislative conference hosted by the Congressional Black Caucus in Washington.
Oh, wow.
I came back to the Bay and started to do more political work. However, as a black woman, I notice oftentimes I'm the only one at the table. How do we encourage more diversity?
Demand it. Fight for it. Bring folks to the table who are as qualified to be there as you are. That's what I say. And when folks say we don't know people like that, give them a resume about 50 to 100 people. Seriously. One of my good friends is a Latino brother named Antonio Tejerino. He's the head of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation out of D.C. And Antonio spent a lot of time here in Silicon Valley, and the thing he kept getting from people, well, there's no Latinos in social media or technology. He said, well, here's 300 resumes, so I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? So you have to push for it, but this, again, is something we have to think about, y'all. Not just no matter who you are, you also, even if you're not that particular group, you have to challenge the lack of diversity. You have to push for it. You know, where are these voices that should be at this table? Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Wow. We got 2 minutes and 56 seconds and
That's
counting.
all we have? No.
We need more time, Lance and Helena and Tracy.
I feel like we just started.
I know. It's just getting good.
Do we have to, don't we have to?
Can we stop that clock?
Don't we have to 3:05?
We have the 3:05. I don't even know what time it is. What
3:05?
time is it now? Oh.
Oh, it's 3:03?
Is that Pacific time or what? We didn't talk about self-care, but
Okay. What was the question?
how do we have these conversations that are hard and not fall out with each other as progressive people? Because I see that a lot where we don't want to, and I've been guilty of it, and people have done it to me. And how do we love each other even if we don't agree with each other on everything or don't understand everything?
I think that's the most important question.
Okay.
I really do. Because I think one of the problems we have on the left and progressive circles is that we get more purist, more righteous, more fabulous than everybody else. And I have suffered from that my whole life, so I am the first to own up to it. I'm older now. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing a lot is that I really believe that the majority of people want to be good.
Yeah.
The majority of people want to grow and change. The majority of people want to evolve. What happens when they step out to try it sometimes is they get zapped. Whether it's online, in a meeting, they say one more, and they're defined as a sexist, racist, we can go down the list.
Yeah.
Transphobic,
Yeah.
you know. I think we have to get away from the things. And we have to really if people are in a space, they're trying to evolve, they're trying to grow, they're trying to become somebody else. That doesn't mean people get a pass. But how we talk to each other, we have to honor each other's where people come from. Like you were talking about before. You didn't know things when you were younger. You came to those things. A lot of people in the middle of the country don't know things. They've been fed on Fox News for years. How do we open our hearts at the same time as we're fierce? To me, that's the duality that we have to live with. And part of it is believing that people really want to be good. That's what I hold in my heart every day. People want to do what's right. There are few people at the top who are privileged, who are hungry, who are power seekers, who are maniacs, and we know who they are. And they fuel the dark side of people, right? But there are also beautiful people who are fueling really good parts of people. And I think all of us have dark and light, and all of us can be swayed. But if we look at each other and I see the light in you, and I keep focusing on the light in you, and I keep inviting the light in you, as opposed to going, proof that you're no one, proof that you're that. You know, I think we're always kind of gotching each other.
That's it.
You know?
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, wow, we're on this journey together, and we're all a mess, and we're all fallible, and we're all, you know, trying to do our best.
One of my great friends is a DJ named DJ Reborn. Robin Rogers is her birth name. And she said that unless someone does something incredibly egregious to you, we just can't be throwing people away. You know, and I think about that. And I mean, do I get upset about stuff? Absolutely. And you know, if you've experienced things a certain kind of way, or organize a certain kind of way, or create plays or books or whatever you do a certain kind of way, you know, you have to think about, you know, well, maybe someone hasn't experienced it the way you experienced it. And you know, and I think it's important to be able to say, I apologize, I'll take ownership for this. This is how I was feeling because of X, Y, and Z, and figure out ways we can come together. I mean, where we started, Eve, is where I want us to end. It's like, you know, we need a progressive, multicultural, multi-generational movement in this country. I do think that self-care piece is important. Like, how do we take care of ourselves as we do this work of service for other people? I think that's important. Is it yoga? Is it meditation? Is it therapy? All of the above. You know, what does love look like for us? You've talked about that a lot. And can you, peace, like you talked about peace. What does that mean for you? I see Lance creeping.
Okay, we're going. I just want to say one thing in terms of self-love.
Yes, ma'am.
For all of us in this audience, and I know there's a lot of activists here.
Yeah.
You got to take care of your bodies. Your bodies are what's holding you. I didn't take care of my body as I got stage 4 cancer, and I lost a lot of organs, and I lost a lot of nodes, and I almost died.
Yeah.
And now I know that this is precious, right? And that is precious. And I think love means that we long for a world, we pray for a world, we imagine a world where every single one of us knows that our struggle is interconnected and that there is nothing separating us but the forces of neoliberal capitalism, racist, patriarchal culture. That's what I think.
Can I say,